Okay, so today we are going to update our user interface resource items. So as you can see, our workers are harvesting and start processing, and here you can see now our resource items at the user interface are updating on real time, right? And let's see how we can do that in the development level. Okay, so in the previous tutorials we have seen how we can add this resource bar to our user interface, but still it's not updating these values properly, right? So you can see we are still printing values at display. So today let's see how we can update these values at real time, but we need to be really careful when it comes to these user interface related activities, because it is quite expensive, and if we haven't done it in a proper way, it will downgrade the performance of your game as well. Okay, so let's try to do it in a better manner, but actually we have to first go to our buildings and resource building base, and at the end processing, this is the function that responsible for printing these values, right? But instead of printing the values, now what we have to do is we have to call a function that updates this user interface, right? Okay, but before that, let's add a global instance to handle these sort of updates, right? Which means um, you remember we have a game state exists, components, PP component RTS game state. Actually, we need to create some variable that globally store these sort of resource values, right? Because first thing, having such global variable is quite easy to access. Plus, when it comes to save and load game system, we can directly use this game state functionalities. Actually, this is not the one. Yeah, I think we have to create a game state component as well, right? We haven't created such component yet. So let's first create it. So it's a component vp comp rts game state. So basically this game state component will act as a component which holds those sort of global variables, right? As I said before. Then we can quite easy to access those values. Plus, when it comes to the save load system, it will be quite easy to handle our saving stuffs. So first let's create a variable called maybe resource amounts, and I'll maybe use a map, right? And the key should be resource type, and the value should be a integer value, right? So basically the respective resource types and the associated value, right? And this is a hash map, which means a unique type will be hold, right? Okay, and then we have to attach this component to our game state. So where is our game state? So under the game base, bprts game state is there, and here let's attach that variable, right? Let's attach that actor component. So game state, right? Yeah, I think maybe this hard functionality also we can move to our uh, game state component, right? So first let me check my documentation. Yeah, so it's quite safe to move this entire thing to the game state actor component, right? Because then in the component level we can handle this initialization and our HUD will just exist as a parent component, right? So let's cut this thing and I'll delete these stuffs, paste it over here, and let's use begin play, right? And our actor component is attached to BP HUD and our HUD is now empty, right? So let's play the game again. See, the resource bar is still appearing because when this actor component is constructed, at the begin play it will create this initialization function, right? Okay, but our main focus is how we can increase this resource amounts, right? So one thing is that we need to now add resource to this variable and increment it accordingly, right? So in order to achieve that, maybe we can create a function. Maybe let's call it as yeah, so it's not a macro, it should be a function. Let's call it as sorry, add resource amount, and as parameters I will take resource type, which is our enumeration value, the resource type, and the next parameter name is amount, which is the resource amount as an integer value, right? So now we have to add or update the values accordingly in this resource amounts map. So first let's get the resource amounts map reference, and let's first find whether we have a record with respect to this specific type, and if we have such a record it will return a true, and we can simply add this resource type, right? So maybe I'll call it as get resource type, and we can simply add this amount to this value, but we have to increment the existing values, right? So the existing values exist over here because if it is found it will return some positive value, so we have to increment this resource amount. So let's get the amount and it to here, right? So if such record exists at our resource amounts map, but at the initial stage it won't contain any record, right? This map will be empty, therefore we have to newly add record of this map type, and this is the resource type, and there is nothing to be incremented, so we can directly plug it over here. Okay, so this is how we can do that update, right? And just for the demonstration purpose, maybe I will add a print string, right? And I will plug this over here as well, and at the print string maybe let's add a format text of the resource type and the respective amount. Okay, so resource type to string and it over here. And so this will just print what's the resource type and the corresponding amount, right, when we are calling this function. And I'll maybe comment this thing called find and add resource amounts. Okay, and this is just for the testing, right? We are printing the values, and now we have to call this function, right? So where are we gonna call this function? Basically at the BP resource building base, instead of printing the value, now let's call that function. But calling that function is a bit tricky. Basically we have to get the game state, and inside that game state we have to get our component, which is RTS game state. And if we have a valid reference, we can call that add resource amount function, right? And the resource type would be associated resource type, and the resource amount will be saved harvested amount, right, which we increment over here. Okay, so each time when a farmer processes resources, it will save the harvested amount at the resource building base level, and it will forward to the game state by calling this add resource amount function. And when it calling this add resource amount function, it will update the records at this resource amounts map, right? So okay, and just for the demonstration purposes, we can print the value. So let's play the game again. Okay, now we start processing. Yeah, now we can see stone, food, wood, they are processing the values, resources, and the values are updating properly at our game state as well. Nice. Now the next step is forward these update values at the corresponding resource site, right? So there are so many approaches we can do that. One thing is we can use direct calling to this resource item, and the next approach would be using interfaces and implement such interface over here and call the function. But I'm going to use a different approach, which is using event dispatcher, right? So as I said before, when it comes to this user interface related activities, we have to be really careful, right? Because we are updating it constantly, and this will affect to the performance as well if you haven't done it properly, right? So by using this event dispatchers, actually it will properly and update the values in more optimized fashion, right? And it's quite easy to handle as well. But basically we have to delegate this dispatcher over here and attach that event listener at our BP resource site, right? So let me first do it, and I'll explain how it happens. So let's create event dispatcher called event on resource amounts update, right? So this is a event, a specific event that should be called over here, right? And this event should grab two inputs, which is this associated resource type, no, actually not here. We can call an event dispatcher at our game state level, right? Yeah, it will be quite easy to call event dispatcher over here, right? Because our game state will be responsible for handling updates at the UI level, right? Not these sort of specific actor instances, right? As I said before, game state is only instantiated one, and this will be a global instance, right? Actually, we can create an event dispatcher over here as well, but it won't be an optimized way. Why? Because we have so many instances of this resource building base, and each of the building will be calling that event dispatcher when it updating the resources, which is not quite good, right? But instead of that, we need to add this event dispatcher to our game state. So our game state will only call it once, right? Because we have only one instance of this game state actor component, right? Then it will be much more optimized, right? See, we have to carefully consider about these factors, otherwise our game will be not optimized. Okay, so I'll create event dispatcher over here called event on resource amount update and call it over here, and this should take two parameters. First one is resource type, which is resource type enumeration, and the corresponding amount of that resource type that should be updated, which is an integer. And we can pass these two values to this event dispatcher, right? So this basically attach an event or calling an event using this game state, and we have to call this, or we have to listen for this event within our resource item, right? Because resource item is the one which ultimately has this unique type and the amount, right? So in order to do that, basically yeah, maybe I'll create a sequence, and at the construction level, the constructor, we have to first call this update resource item, and then we can call that or we can listen for that event at the game state, right? So let's get the game state and get component by class game state, and if this is valid, we can bind an event on resource amount update, right? Make sure to use this thing, right? Because this is the event listener, so we have to bind an event listener to this specific event dispatcher, right? Okay, and whenever this listener is invoked, we can instantiate the custom function. Maybe I'll call this as update, and it will automatically give these two parameters for us, because at the game state level we have passed those two variables at the dispatcher, and at the listener level it will grab those values, right, at the receiver side. Okay, and we have to check if these two types are matched, right? Because let's say if you are going to update the wood values only, then it should be updated this specific resource item. Likewise, they have unique types of resources, so it should update those types uniquely. And if the type matched, then we can simply increment this amount by adding to the local amount, right? Something like this. Amount will be incremented like this. Okay, and then after this execution, we should call this update resource item function again, because this is the one ultimately update our UI values. Okay, so we call it over here, and we pass the values over here. Okay, so I think it should work now. So maybe let's try to play the game. Okay, so they harvested certain values, and yeah, so you can see those values updated, right? So 60, 30, and 60 values are updating properly. But I think we need to fix these initial values, right? Because initially we have set up those values as 10. So let's make those as 0. Okay. And one other thing, so we already incrementing our harvested resource over here and pass it to the resource amount. So those are the already incremented values, and it will receive at the UI end or front end or user interface resource item, and we don't need, I think, again increment the amounts, right? Because this is an already incremented value, but I'm not quite sure. So let's maybe unplug those incrementation and just directly attach it to the amount, and let's try to play it again. Okay, so they are harvesting 50, 20, and 50. Okay, 20 updated, 50 updated, and 50 updated. Great. Okay, let's wait for another cycle. Okay, now food is incremented by 100. Okay, wood is also incremented, and stone was incremented. Perfect. So it works properly. And one other thing, I think this code is duplicated, right? Because I think we have called the same component at some different place as well. Yeah, it is. Not here. Maybe let's try to find the references globally. Yeah, so here we also have this duplicated code, right? So this is known as code duplication. And again, as I said before, if you are going to follow the best practices, we should avoid these sort of code duplications, right? So let's create a function library to hold such utility functions. So at the blueprint level, maybe I'll create a new folder called function libraries, and over here let's create a blueprint function library. I'll name this as BFL RTS game utilities, and let's create a function called get RTS game game state, right? And let's grab that duplicated code over here and paste it here, right? So we get the game state, get the actor component. If it is valid, we can safely return that value, which is BP component RTS game state. If not, we can return a null value, which is an invalid reference. And now we can remove this code, and instead of that we can now call that utility function directly over here, right? And one other thing, let's make this utility function as pure, because we are not manipulating any values over here, right? We are just reading a value, right? So that will be a pure function, and in the pure function level we can call it like this, right? And let's grab this node, and what's the other place we had that duplication over here, right? In the resource building base, let's remove this thing and add it to here, right? So now you can see the code is much organized, and it is clean, right? So maybe I'll comment this thing called update the game state, and for this one locally update the context, right? Okay, and now I don't need to actually print these things, right? But if you want to debug these values, maybe I'll create a variable called debug resource amounts, and let's make it a boolean, and I'll assign it to category called debug instant editable, and we can directly attach this to this here in this patcher, and maybe let's add a sequence, and over here if we require to debug resource amounts, then we can print the values, right? Otherwise we don't need to print those values. Okay, and I'll comment this thing as debug resource amount, assign some sort of color like this, right? Okay, great. So I think now our code is clean, and our values are updating properly as well. So let's play test one more time. Okay, yeah, values are updating properly. Great. So before wind up, I will quickly recap what we have done, right? Because I think this one is a bit more complex if you are not familiar with Unreal Engine ever before. So we actually started from here, right? At the game state. In the game state, we have created this resource amounts map, and we created a function to increment that. And over there, we called an event dispatcher to dispatch this event globally, right? So whoever listen to this dispatched event can grab these two values, which is resource types and resource amount. And at the resource building base level, we locally update the saved hosted resource amount context, but this is just local context, and we have to forward that updated value to the game state. So the game state will hold the latest value of this local context, right? So that's why we call this add resource amount function at the building level. And building level, we call that function. It will invoke over here, and the corresponding amounts will be updated and dispatch an event. So we listen to this event at our WB resource item, which is a UI component, and we listen to that event, and whenever it invoked this event listener or dispatch some values via this event listener or event dispatcher, we listen to those values and update the values accordingly, right? And ultimately it will update the UI artifacts. So that's the entire workflow. And yeah, so I think we have covered a very important part in our RTS game, which is real-time user interface updates. And yeah, so in the next tutorial I will see more interesting stuff. So thank you. I'll see you in the next video.